So many things come to mind when we think of tone. You might think of a dial tone like the one you just heard, or other sorts of sounds like a musical scale, or perhaps that annoying beep when a television or radio broadcasting network interrupts this regularly scheduled programming to bring you an important announcement. If you're an artist, you might think immediately about the tints and shades of colors. If you're an athlete, you might think about muscle tone. As writers, however, we must think about intonation, style, our manner of expression, and the mood and formality of our words. Tone is something we easily pick up on in speech. According to Simon and Schuster's A Handbook for Writers, tone in writing operates like tone of voice, except in writing we can't rely on facial expressions and voice intonations to communicate our messages. When we talk with one another, we automatically pick up on verbal and nonverbal cues that help us determine what mood a person is in, the particular inflections in people's voices, whether or not they are smiling, the look in their eyes, how they move their bodies, etc. Suppose a friend has asked me, "Don't I look great in my new outfit?" I respond with the statement you see on the screen. What is my tone? Can you tell if I'm being sincere or sarcastic? If you were to guess, your first instinct would most likely be to read it as a sincere statement. Why? Because in writing, we expect people to say what they mean. If I wanted my audience to read this statement sarcastically, I'd need to do a better job of creating tone. This is much easier in speech. If I respond to my friend, "Yeah, you look great in that outfit," you can tell I'm being sincere. I think my friend looks great. If, however, I say it this way, "Yeah, you look great in that outfit," you know I'm being sarcastic or insincere. This time, determining my tone was not likely a very difficult task. That's because we talk to people every day. We have lots of practice determining the moods of the people around us because it affects us in both direct and indirect ways. For example, imagine your boss is irate with your team for failing to complete a project by the deadline. His anger is evident by the elevated volume of his voice, his narrowed eyes, red face, and use of harsh words. You may not be consciously aware that you are absorbing this data, but you are, and your brain uses this information to determine your boss's tone. Based on his tone, you determine that it's probably not the best time to ask for that raise you've been wanting. Instead, you will probably wait a few days or even weeks until he is in a better mood. Determining and creating tone in writing is a much more difficult task than creating it in speech, because we don't have as many tools to rely on to help us convey the tone in which we want our audience to interpret our words. So what do we do? Where do we start? The first step in creating tone in writing is determining what the situation calls for. Ray Noguchi, author of Grammar and the Teaching of Writing, puts it this way. If a rough analogy may be made, the problem of non-standard or unconventional forms in formal writing is somewhat akin to wearing jeans and sneakers when the occasion calls for a suit and dress shoes. It is not that jeans are intrinsically wrong and that a suit and dress shoes are intrinsically right. Who in their right mind would wear the latter attire to the beach? Rather, different situations call for different styles. The choice of style, or dialect as the case may be, is no less significant in language, particularly in writing, where the nature of the medium heightens the assumption that addressers have taken the time to refine their message to meet the needs and expectations of the addressees. In other words, if you were to take a trip to the beach with friends, you would likely wear swimming attire, or perhaps shorts and flip-flops. If you were to wear this same attire to a job interview, however, how would that affect the way the interviewer perceived you? Do you think you would be hired? No, of course not. Swimwear and shorts and flip-flops, while appropriate for the beach, are highly inappropriate for a job interview. The two situations call for very different styles. The importance of the style of language you use is no different from the style of clothing you wear. You must change your style based on the situation. A note to your roommate, for example, will likely be, to some degree, informal. A cover letter for a job application, on the other hand, must take a much more formal tone. So how do we determine what the situation calls for? We examine the rhetorical context. First, we examine our message. What is it that you have to say? Then we need to look at our purpose. This is your reason for writing, or in other words, why you want to share this particular message. You also must consider who you are writing to and in what format. Most of us would not speak to our parents, supervisors, or teachers the same way we would speak to our closest friends. Out of respect for their positions, we would normally take a more formal tone. The same types of considerations must be made of our audience when we write. All of these factors, message, purpose, audience, and medium, will influence your tone. If you are writing about a presidential election, for example, you may think you have a serious message. But it's not serious if your purpose is to make your audience laugh at a comedic story about one of the candidates. If, however, your purpose is to convince an audience of voters of a particular candidate's superiority via a newspaper or magazine article or even a personal blog entry, you would want to take a more serious, formal tone. Once you've determined the tone your writing should take, you can control the tone of your writing and adjust it accordingly. Writers accomplish this goal primarily through diction or specific word choice, syntax, the order of the words, and sentence structure. We'll look at a couple examples to see how this works, but first, let's break it down a little bit. Informal writing often relies on first and second person. Formal writing, on the other hand, usually favors third person. Informal writing often uses figures of speech, cliches, or colloquial expressions, while formal writing avoids conventions of speech. Informal writing often incorporates slang vocabulary. Formal writing usually avoids slang in favor of a more sophisticated vocabulary. Informal writing may not use politically correct language choices, while formal writing will use neutral and non-sexist language whenever possible. Informal writing can be wordy. Formal writing usually is concise. Informal writing may make use of contractions, while formal writing will avoid them. Informal writing may use numerals, while formal writing will typically spell out numbers. Informal writing may contain many question marks and exclamation points, but formal writing is typically more concerned with asserting claims than with asking questions or making exclamations. Informal writing may often deviate from edited American English for no apparent reason. Formal writing relies heavily on the standards of edited American English, breaking from it only when necessary to make a point. Informal writing often takes an obviously subjective stance, whereas formal writing typically presents a more objective tone. Informal writing may contain many short, simple sentences, and formal writing usually relies on longer, more complex sentence structures. These are just a few examples of differences between informal and formal writing. This is not to say that formal writing may never contain any of the conventions of informal writing or vice versa. But the more qualities a piece of writing contains from the list on the right, the more formal the tone your writing becomes. Likewise, the more qualities a piece of writing contains from the list on the left, the more informal your tone. It is ultimately your responsibility as the writer to determine how formal or informal your writing needs to be, and which conventions of formal and informal writing you will use and why. Let's look at some examples. Informal. Me and my friend Sam went to the Pride Festival. You know, the one in Springfield last weekend? Anyway, it was really fun, and there were tons of people there to back up their gay friends. This passage is slightly more formal or semi-formal. My friend Sam and I went to the Springfield Pride Festival last weekend. It was fun, and hundreds of local citizens were there to show support for the LGBT community. And this passage is even more formal. My friend Sam and I, among hundreds of other local citizens, enjoyed attending the Springfield Pride Festival last weekend to demonstrate our support for the LGBT community. In the informal passage, note the use of non-conventional grammatical structures such as me and my friend instead of my friend and I. The use of questions and conversational language such as anyway, like, you know, and the reliance on relatively simplistic sentence structures. The semi-formal passage, by contrast, collapses the content of 3 sentences into 2. It relies on the conventions of edited American English and eliminates those conversational filler words. The formal passage further collapses the content we are working with into a single sentence by utilizing a much more sophisticated sentence structure than either the informal or the semi-formal passage, and it makes use of a bit more sophisticated vocabulary, such as demonstrated in place of show. Now that you know some strategies to help you create a more formal tone in your writing and have seen an example of a few of these strategies in action, revisit a piece of your own writing and practice this technique on your own. Remember, reading your writing aloud can help you identify places in your writing where your tone needs to be adjusted.